I'm going to show how to make this complex gradient effect using Affinity Photo's procedural texture filter. I was experimenting with the Perlin noise effect, and it has, it looks sort of like clouds, but I was looking for something with a little more grit to it, and I know you can add turbulence to it, but I started experimenting it to try to get a little better look, and I came up with this pattern, and I was working on this gradient series, and I thought this would make a great gradient. So today I'm going to show you how this works and how to achieve an effect like this. I'm calling it complex gradient just because it's more complicated than the simpler gradients I was working on earlier. I'm going to be using some of the concepts I presented in my earlier videos, such as stretching and rotation. So if you're not familiar with those, have a look at some of my earlier videos. To get started, I'll start with a new document, and I'll make it 1024 by 1024. I'm going to fill it with black. Use the Move tool to select it and go down to the bottom of the live filters and add a live procedural texture filter. I'll add a single equation, assign it to all three channels, and I'll add a single real number input variable and just leave that as A. And to get started, I'll just start out with variable V equals vec2 of Rx and Ry times A divided by W. I'm going to be using the OSCI oscillator to demonstrate what I'm going to do with this. So I'll just do an OSCI of V, get the checkerboard oscillator up there. I'm going to increase my A a little bit. And so there's my checkerboard pattern. So to do this technique, I want to be able to modulate the XY coordinate system. So I'm going to modulate this. And the most typical way to do this is to add a turbulence factor. And so if I add a variable, a 0 to 1 slider, I give it the letter T for turbulence. Now up here in the coordinates for the oscillator where I have V, I'm going to add on a T times dir of V. Okay, and so it sort of takes that coordinate system and adds a random element to it, stretches it in all different directions. So it looks like this. T times dir of V. Now sometimes you can add in a scaling factor for the turbulence so it has a different frequency than your main oscillator. And so I'll just multiply the V inside of the dir by letter B here to do that. So as I bring this up, it has a higher frequency, and so when I bring this in, it starts affecting it more. The function dir generates two random numbers. First of all is the length of a vector going from 0 to 1. So it generates a random length for the length of a vector going from 0 to 1. And then it generates a random angle for the vector going from 0 to 360 degrees, or 0 to 2 pi if you prefer radians. It then converts those into component vectors, and so it is actually a vector element that contains an x and a y component for each of those random vectors that it generated. There's another one called udir. udir only generates a single random variable, the direction for the vector. The length is always 1. I'll just look at dir by itself. And you can see it's like this. Because it's a vector, it's applied to the red and green channels. If I turn off one of these, it'll jump to the other available channel. So it actually has two elements in it. And there's a few different varieties. That one, the first one, if just dir is linear, if I add an I to it, you get this pixelated version of it. Still a vector though. And then you could also have an S curve or a sine. or even a CS like this, which is sort of a rounded, it's sharp on the edges but rounded on the top. So a few different varieties of directional noise. I'm going to use the S-curve version of it because I think that's the smoothest. And then I'll just put this back into my turbulence factor. Now this is the SC, and you can see it's a little smoother. The next thing I'm going to do is to change this to a Perlin noise. And so I'll use perlincubic, and I'm going to add two other variables, an O for octave and an S for the smoothness factor. And octaves, I'll set that up as a integer value because they really can only be integers. It'll work if you add a real number, but I'll just leave it as integer. And I'll add a smoothness factor, and that's what it looks like. And you can see that as I add turbulence, it increases this. And it already, compared to regular Perlin noise, which is sort of looks just like clouds, I scale that up a little, you know, it looks a little more interesting. And I can change the frequency of this like that. And it has a, to me, it gives it a much more sort of organic, I mean, it gives it a more interesting feel to it. But I was looking for something more. And so instead of this is just based on plain noise. I thought, well, what about if I use Perlin noise for this one, which I did. So I'm going to change this to perlincubic, and I'll add an O and an S in here, and I'll just use the same O and S as I used for the other one. So if I add perlincubic, it gives this additional sort of thing to it, and I like it. If I add an H in here, I think then it goes in both directions and just sort of smears that out and gets much more complicated. If I add the smoothness all the way up, though, I see it has sort of this linear relationship, and so I sort of wanted to get rid of that factor. But I do really like how it looks. So to get rid of that, I thought about the directional vector, and I remembered, oh yeah, that one is a vector. Whereas this, if I just add perlincubic, it's not really a vector. So I can make it into a vector. So I'm going to do vec2 of perlincubic. So to make this into a vector, I'm just going to copy another copy of this perlincubic and paste it in right here, and then I'll put in a parenthesis to finish off the vector. Now these are still, this is the same as it was before because it's not going to change at all because they're exactly the same. But what I can do to sort of make it so they're not correlated, they're not closely connected to each other, I can just subtract off a large constant from them or add on a large constant. So I'm going to subtract a W from this one, and now they should no longer be correlated. So when I bring the smoothness all the way up, it just looks random. I can also change the frequency of these. I could also add a divisor, so I can divide out by a number to make it longer. So if I divide each of these by the letter C here, a little longer, and it gives a little bit different effect for that. But I think it has real nice organic feel to it. You can look around and find some really interesting areas for this one. I'm going to go ahead and apply a gradient map to this, and so I'll just choose one that I already have selected, I've already put in here. I'm going to set this up as a variable, and I'll call it T1 for texture 1. So here's what the formula looks like so far. I've got a variable T1, it's perlincubic, V plus T, turbulence, times a vector 2 that consists of two perlincubic components. And they all have the same O and S values. This one I'm multiplying by B and dividing by C, sort of give it a ratio of the frequency. I want to be able to stretch this out and rotate it. So first I'm going to add the rotation. I'm going to add an angle input, call it TH for the angle theta. And I'm going to change my Rx and Ry coordinates to Rx times cosine of theta, or of TH, minus Ry times sine of TH. And then my Ry is over here, is I'm going to change that one to Rx times sine of TH plus Ry times cosine of TH. And so now I should be able to rotate this. Now it's just noise, so you don't notice too much difference when I rotate it. But I'm going to add an elongation factor to this, and I'll just do that with a real number. I'll call it XY, and I'll call it stretch. So I'll be able to stretch this out, and if I make this larger, it'll stretch it farther. To do the stretching factor, I think right at the very beginning up here, I'll put in a variable SV, and that'll be a vec2, but it'll be just 1, and then the XY value, and like that. And then I'm going to normalize this. So the shorthand for normalize is NORM. I'm going to put that in like that. I want my scaling vector to, or my stretching vector to only affect certain things. So I want to have a noise component, but I don't want that affected by the stretching vector. So I could put it in here. Now that's sort of interesting because it stretches out the Perlin noise, but it doesn't stretch out the turbulence effect. And I sort of like that, but for this one, I want it to stretch the turbulence too, so I'm going to go ahead and multiply that by the two turbulence components as well. And now I want to create another variable for the noise. It'll be variable T2 equals noise of V, and I think I want to do H cubic for the type of noise, and that'll be V. Now this one I want to scale it by, I'm going to have its own scaling factor, but I'm going to start out by multiplying it by 10 because for the noise I want it to be quite small. There's my cubic noise. I sort of like it. It has sort of a nice reticulated look to it, and I could use regular noise, but I'm going to use that one for that. I'm going to add another real variable. I'll just leave it with D. This will be the noise scale. I'll label that as noise scale. Bring this up a little bit to about 10, and then I need to multiply it times the coordinate system over here. So I need to multiply my noisehcubic in the coordinate system by D. So let's take a look at what I've got so far. So I've got my perlincubic. I've got that scaled with that scaling vector. I multiplied it up here in all three terms. And then over here, I'm not using the scaling vector, but I've got 10 times D. And there's my noise, so I can make it a nice fine grain noise. Now that I've got my two texture patterns, I'm going to set up some variables for the final form of this. So I'm going to add one for just I for the fader, and -1 to 1 for an offset. And then I'll add another one for the noise fader. I'll just call it I2. So this is my fader for the main pattern. This is the offset for the main pattern, and then this will be the noise fader. So I can fade that in and out. Okay, now we got to write the formula up here. So that's going to be T1 times I plus T2 times I2 plus OF, like that. Okay, so I'm going to bring my noise way down, and I'm going to sweep this into a different range. I'm going to bring the stretch factor down a little bit. Again, I could also change this so that the turbulence is not stretched. Right now, both of them are stretched, but I could change, or I could even put in a separate XY factor for turbulence. That also works sort of nice. It gives you a little extra flexibility, but for this one, I'm just going to leave it like this. Okay, I can add an offset here like that, and add a little bit of noise. It makes a nice sort of texture like that. Now, I'm going to save this as a preset, and I've got a category of these for gradients. I'm going to put that down there, and I'm just going to call this one complex gradient. Okay, so it's getting pretty long. I've got a scaling vector, I've got my rotation coordinates, I've got a perlincubic that is being modulated. The coordinate system is being modulated by two other versions, uncorrelated versions of perlincubic, and I've got my noisehcubic, and then finally I mix them all together in the final bit of the formula. And it gives you quite a bit of flexibility. I'm also using the alpha channel this time to change the transparency, and that way you can stack different colors on top of each other. So you could have different splashes of different colors sort of showing up in different locations. Here's some examples of some of the effects I've been able to generate using this procedural texture filter. It gives a wide variety of effects. I use some different palettes, and sometimes I've used the alpha channel or stacked a couple of these on top of each other. That's all I have for now, and thank you for watching. Let me know if you have any comments or questions.